Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Matt Calabro. I'm a Managing Director at Salus GRC. We've launched the Navigator webinar series as a way to connect with the compliance community and to cover timely topics. Today's topic is keeping in step with E-Comm monitoring and archiving oversight. I'm fortunate today to be joined by Kelly Ryan, who's the Chief Compliance Officer at Zeiss Group, an alternative credit manager, and Kelly Kazuska, a partner at Schulte, Roth & Zabel. In our conversation today, we hope to share a variety of perspectives and some practical ideas that you can apply to your compliance program. To keep it simple, and for my sanity, I'm going to simply refer to them as Kelly R and Kelly K. Today, we're going to talk about challenges in managing electronic communications, especially off-channel communications. So we're going to start with an overview of the current regulatory landscape, the climate, and some of the challenges that we face in real life. Next, we'll talk about some of the considerations when developing policies and procedures, and then we'll wrap up by discussing how to make it all work, including some of the technology considerations. During the discussion, we'll ask a few polling questions just to see what folks are doing today. Hopefully there are no right or wrong answers to those, but we really do want to get your feedback on what's happening in your own shops. We also welcome you to submit questions in the box on your screen, and we'll try to address some of those as we go. So looking at the current landscape, I'm sure that everyone is aware that the SEC has been very active in seeking enforcement actions against broker-dealers and advisors for primarily record-keeping failures related to off-channel communications. They've assessed over $2 billion in fines in those actions over the last couple of years. When I look at this, compliance folks tend to want to reverse engineer or look at an enforcement action and figure out what the takeaways are. Kelly K, what are the messages to firms as we look at this?
So to be honest, I think it's a little inconsistent if we look across examinations and also enforcement actions. The SEC in the most recent round has had some no penalty actions for self-reporting, but these aren't the first actions that have had self-reports, and we've seen significant fines attached to at least one other self-report. We've also seen the examination staff, which obviously the deficiencies they bring and their inquiries aren't public, but we've seen them take a variety of approaches. I think in the most recent round at the end of the last fiscal year that just ended last month, I think what was very noteworthy was the Catalyst case, not only because it was a no penalty action, but because there was a dissent. And I think the dissenting commissioners said what a lot of us have been feeling and thinking, that this went from going after broker-dealers and registered investment advisors who had such pervasive problems that they were undermining the staff's ability to conduct investigations, and has really moved toward a standard that's almost impossible to achieve of perfection, and really applying old record-keeping rules that were written well before the internet or instant messaging or any of these really convenient forms of communication. And so we're applying old rules, very stretched approach to these rules. Certainly from the RIA perspective, we think the SEC is reading the rules much more broadly than they were written. And then just have investment advisors who are really trying to get it right, but struggling because it can just be so hard if you really think the standard is every single communication that in any way touches on work has to be captured.
Yeah, some of the things that, you know, when I look at this issue, it really does come down to, we know we can't be perfect, right? There's always been a message somewhere. And I wonder if that kind of leads back or leads to how the firms maybe don't push back as much in the exam phase and get to this penalty phase. Or is it just truly a matter of, you know, maybe particularly clear in the first couple of cases that they were so egregious and so flaunting the rules at every level of the organization that, you know, this thing just got rolling and we don't know where it stops?
Yeah, so my understanding is that very few of these cases actually came from exam referrals. Some have, but I think a majority were ones that came out of enforcement. And you can even tell when you read some of these actions that they started as something else. The SEC was either issued a subpoena because it was investigating a complete other party, or was looking at a manager or a broker-dealer for one thing, and then it morphed into a texting action. So that texting, because it's so pervasive, because you can almost always find a texting violation. If the SEC is there looking for something, it's almost like a tax you're going to pay even if you've done nothing else wrong. I think in the examination context, we've been looking at this issue for years, well before the JP Morgan case. The exam staff was very focused on where they saw pervasive failures. And so we saw that in deficiency letters. We were trying to get the word out years ago, but it was a very hard issue to get your arms around, and there really wasn't an enforcement action to point to. Before JP Morgan, about a year before JP Morgan, there was a $100,000 case called Jones Trading that nobody focused on. It really took that headline grabbing $200 million case to get the industry focused on it, because it did require such a shift in how we thought about record keeping and also what we could do about it. I think the pendulum has gone too far in the other direction, and I think that's what was being expressed in the dissent, and that's why I think it resonated with so many people who have been grappling with this issue. I do think you're right that perfection shouldn't be the standard, and we've really focused on, when we're working with compliance programs at investment advisors, how do we get to a better place? You're never going to have 100% compliance, but how do we, through policies and procedures that are a little bit more reasonable, opening up communication channels so that people can have instant communications that are captured. I think a world where you say you can only use email, you can only use Bloomberg, doesn't work for most investment professionals, given how quickly these things move. And then we've also worked into a lot of compliance programs, self-reporting within the organization, so that if you are self-policing and you're saying to your, taking a screenshot saying, I just sent this message, or I just received this message, or using the certification process to go through your phone and just find anything that might touch on work. At a number of organizations, they're considering that to be compliance. So you're getting fewer footfalls and more people who really focused on compliance and trying to do this right. We do think, for the most part, this is a matter of convenience. It's not because investment professionals wanted to circumvent systems. It was really because, as I mentioned, email and Bloomberg and some of the channels we had available, and for a while, some of the only channels that we could collect and preserve because of some of the limits of the technology previously, that we ended up here.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and we'll talk more about building the policies and procedures later. But Kelly R., I think, looking at these cases and just talking to folks in your seat, feels like a lot of CCOs are confused and probably a little bit scared. So when you look at this, what kind of challenges do you wrestle with around, putting a policy in place, talking to your folks, how to proceed?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. It is definitely scary, and it certainly has kept me up at night. And I think that the challenge is just what we said before, is that it seems like the expectation is perfection, and we're really struggling with kind of striking the right balance between, putting systems or technologies in place, and wondering really whether it will be enough if we're ever in even an exam scenario, right? Let alone an enforcement scenario. So it almost seems like nothing you can do will, let you escape scot-free with no enforcement action. So some of the things that we've thought about are moving to firm-issued devices. Thinking about what other sort of technologies we can implement to capture messages. But I think key is just sort of understanding how your organization functions as sort of a baseline.
Yeah, it feels like, at some level, privacy starts to come into the equation. Absolutely. Here too, right? And, of course, we tell people don't have an expectation when you're using, a company channel, but, then we start talking about off channel and it starts to get a little gooey.
Yeah, that's a really sort of gray area, right? You don't want to run afoul of, privacy laws, but it really does make people uncomfortable if you need to look at their personal messages. So we've struggled with that quite a bit too.
Yeah, and I think on that point, beyond just the actual privacy laws, it's a cultural issue. Right? Yep. You normally you have disclosures, so employees are on notice that you can look for all the messages and that they don't have an expectation of privacy. But if you go in there, because you need your employees not just to be complying day one, but throughout this, I think a lot of firms feel like if they took this really aggressive approach, completely disregarded their personnel's privacy concerns, right? Even if there wasn't an actual legal issue, that they just wouldn't get buy-in going forward. And that's not culturally where they want to be. They want a place that's a little more cooperative and collaborative.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I do think that you can strike a balance between respecting people's privacy, but also encouraging them to share, information. So yeah, agreed. It's totally a cultural issue.
Yeah. One of the other challenges I see, especially, when you're thinking about text messaging and bringing them back on is, when does a message become the firm's record or need to become the firm's record, I guess. And of course, FINRA has a different standard for broker dealers than the SEC does for investment advisors. But I think it gets thorny, and there's a personal relationship between coworkers. For example, that line gets real blurry. And I think, in some of the work we've done, we'll see a text conversation, over the course of 2 minutes float between things that are clearly business matters, things that are gossip about a coworker, and then things that are purely personal, like the planning a kid's birthday party or whatever. And just kind of, trying to parse that and work through it is, can get a little uncomfortable from some of those things. But I think there's also a slippery slope problem here, right? And for example, if you've got a financial advisor maybe texting a retail client, it's one thing to send a message and say, I'm running 5 minutes late, versus I'm running 5 minutes late and I look forward to talking to you about repositioning your portfolio, versus I'm running 5 minutes late and I look forward to talking to you about adding Microsoft to your portfolio, right? So, depending on the context, 1, 2, or 3 of those messages may be substantive business, records that need to be retained. FINRA would probably argue all 3 of them are. But, I think Kelly Kay, when we start looking at these messages, how do you think about bucketing them? And I know you've done a lot of engagements for firms, kind of going back through forensically.
Yeah. So part of it depends are we on the front end designing policies in terms of what we're going to require to be captured? Yeah. Or are we on the back end defending whether or not the communications that were off channel were actually violative of the rules? And so, I'll start with the intellectual piece of it, and then I'll get off my soapbox. But it's very frustrating for us on the RIA, from the RIA perspective, that the SEC has taken such a broad view of 2042, well beyond what the adopting release shows it was intended to do, or even what its position was back in 2018 when it issued a risk alert. It says that this is a continuation of that, but really we were looking more at those categories that are listed out in 2042. But I think what people often don't realize, but we've definitely seen in the exam and enforcement context, is for RIAs, although the SEC has focused heavily on 2042 and the record-keeping obligations, it also sees the failure to collect messages as an issue under 204A, which requires you to have policies and procedures to prevent the misuse of material non-public information, because the SEC will say, if you're not collecting all the messages, how is any surveillance really meaningful? And then also under 20647, the compliance rule. So it is much broader than 2042. And in the RIA sweep, the MFA did put in a letter pushing back on the SEC's take on 2042, and those arguments were rejected. In the RIA sweep, we've also seen that the SEC, for purposes of collecting messages, has said, if it says, call me back, that's logistical. But if it says, call me back regarding Microsoft, because it's a specific name, then that's responsive to the SEC. So we've really seen the SEC take a very broad view. As a practical matter, as I mentioned, it's different whether we're designing policies or defending them. I think what we've found is, even if you could write a policy that used buckets, it's just not practical that your people are really going to switch. Well, now I'm talking about a trade, but here I'm not. So we focused more on personal versus work, but then even within that have had to really drill down. If you have a mixed relationship, are you really going to be good about separating the two? And to your point, Matt, on the slippery slope, if you really have one that goes back and forth all day long between the weekend plans you're making and what's happening in the markets, unless you find someone who can really switch back and forth between the 2 apps, which almost no one can do given how quickly we move, we're often saying just put that on the work channel so that we make sure to capture it. We are trying to stay away from the purely personal. As Kelly mentioned before, that can create a lot of embarrassing issues and also cultural issues for firms. And then in those cases where it's mostly personal, that's where we found the self-policing, where we're using certifications and people actually looking at their phones and saying, okay, this is mostly personal, but in between talking about these birthday parties, there is a message here about a name. Let me take a screenshot. Let me turn it in. The people who are sitting there parsing from their phones, finding those messages that are just over the line, those aren't the employees we're worried about. If anything, we point to those employees as showing how robust our program is. I think it's the ones that, they're in a sensitive business area where text is very pervasive, and they're filling out the certification, checking a box, never saying they ever have a message that's off channel. I think that's where we sometimes push a little more. Just even if they're 100% accurate, the SEC is going to scrutinize it. So we want to make sure that they're really being thoughtful about the process.
But I think that's almost a generic point, right? I think if you're a CCO looking at your compliance program and you conclude everything's great, there's nothing to see here, right? As opposed to maybe having some thoughtful things that you're working to improve on or whatever that show up in your 20647. It kind of fits in that same bucket. No, of course not. There's absolutely never, we're 100% right.
I think you're right. I think that's a generally that's true. When you have that question on exams, list all your exceptions. The firm that says, no, we've never, ever had an exception to our policies, it's much less compelling than the one that cites a couple places where people haven't pre-cleared trades. But I think with employees, I think we really, and training was a big piece of this, when we first started saying, take a screenshot, send it in, some employees thought that was a trick. If you're automatically going to call that a violation, maybe I'll just wait to see if I get caught. And so they're really, for the firms that decided that they did want to promote self-policing, you really had to shift the mindset and say, no, it's actually the people who aren't even trying who are going to be more on our radar than the people who are trying to get this right and making an effort.
Yeah, and I've seen firms try to run, amnesty programs or something like that to repatriate messages back into the systems. I think one of the things when I looked at some of the enforcement actions, though, is, some of the inferences in those enforcement actions got a little scary, right? That they really think you are looking at every personal message. And again, I still think it comes back to, well, I can't police my employees' behavior 24/7. They're going to be allowed to have a personal email account. Their spouse is going to be allowed to have a personal email account. And we can't pull all that in, right? So, but when you, especially that last batch of actions, you really looked at it and said, well, is that what they're implying? And it really, kind of a long way from maybe the JP Morgan where it felt really egregious because they're using, WhatsApp on the desk versus, some of these other ones towards the end. It was just kind of a little unsettling in that regard. So let's move to our first polling question. And I want to find out, and again, I think there's no wrong answer here, but when did you last update your E-Comm procedures? Has it been within the last 6 months, 6 to 12 months, in the last year or two, or more than 2 years ago? So everybody should be able to just click an option there and vote, and we'll see what everybody thinks. But I think there probably could be some. If you, like Kelly said, if you get on this early, your procedures could have been put together a couple of years ago and still hold up. But, I think it's what I'm interested in is, are people, being really reactive to these enforcement actions and really forcing themselves back to looking at things. So we'll wait a few more seconds here. We'll get some responses in. It looks like we've plateaued. So where are we at here? So it looks like everybody, for the most part, folks have been very active in reviewing procedures here recently since the actions and the sweeps have been going on. So, very least it's causing people to go back to their policies. So, when we think about setting up policies and procedures, I think, especially with respect to E-Comms, it's important to make sure that firms have good policies and procedures, especially around employee conduct. One of the things I'm kind of adamant about in the employee conduct space, especially, is that policies and procedures are clear and simple, right? So obviously 20647 says that they need to be reasonably designed. They should be specific to the business, and we see that cited a lot in enforcement actions on, any number of topics. Policies themselves should really reflect the firm's values and clearly state what's allowed and what's not allowed. And then let the procedures, accurately reflect what you're going to do and not necessarily what you aspire to do. And we see firms have gotten in trouble with that on a number of topics in over the years. So, and I think back here to the enforcement case against Senvest, which was, I think, the first pure investment advisor to have an enforcement action in this space. And, at the end of the day, what did them in is their procedures said that they would periodically review personal text messages for doing that. So, it kind of comes back to, my high school civics teacher told me, say what you do, and really thinking through, some of those things when you put them together. And I think making sure your procedures really clearly define the process and identify the steps an employee needs to take to comply with the policy. And I think in this area too, I'd point back to the risk alert that the SEC put out in 2018, and they really did lay out a lot of criteria. Kelly Kay will talk about it in a minute because I know you have some thought. But then one of the other things that were in there too is that the procedure should make clear the consequences for violating the policy. So, I think it's, Kelly Kay, you want to pick up there and maybe some of the thoughts of what you've seen with the risk alert versus, maybe how it's been applied here in some of these cases?
Sure. So I think your point on simplicity is a good one, particularly on this one, which is going to touch everybody in the firm. So in some cases, and there's no right way to do this, but in some cases we were working with policies where the E-Comm policy was kind of interwoven with cyber policies. So it was, we wanted to make it even clearer. You can use this, you can't use this, and this is what you do if you've gone off channel. Just because we didn't want there to be confusion about what was approved and what wasn't approved. We looked to the 2018 risk alert in our template policies. There was, the SEC referred to, if you receive a message that's off channel, promptly move it over on channel. We take that a little further with a number of our policies, if it makes sense for the manager, and say sent or received. And that was that self-policing I was talking about. And the thinking is, while we know the SEC's strong preference is for something that goes directly into a compliance archive, so there's no opportunity to delete it. If you really believe that the heart of these messages is that, the heart of these cases is that if you don't have the messages, it will undermine your compliance program and your ability to comply with enforcement actions and examinations, then the most important thing is getting the messages promptly. So we wanted to de-emphasize were you absolutely perfect? Did it come in the way it was supposed to come into? And really focused on getting those messages. So on a go-forward basis, that was about trainings, making some updates to policies, seeing if we could give a little bit more breathing room if it made sense for the particular manager, and getting those kind of self-policing things in place. A much harder decision that's definitely firm-specific is, do you want to look backwards? Some places just wanted to say, like, going forward, we're going to do a lot better. We know we're taking some chances on looking backward. Other firms realize that because of certifications and other actions they were afraid they might be part of, that it would really put them in a hard position if they're in an exam and only have, X number of messages because texting has been used for a long time. So I find that's not really, we don't speak to that in the policy. The policy is, what is in effect today and going forward. But in looking at how to get firms into compliance, that was definitely a hard decision point for many places.
Yeah, and is that just kind of taking a beat of your business and saying, hey, as maybe the senior leader or whatever, I've been texting and I know that's how, one of the ways we tend to communicate around here, and then just trying to clean that up and say, okay, maybe in this instance, and given the nature of our business, there might be some risk here in the history. So we make the decision to go back.
I think that's where, though, talking to your people is really important because, different teams are going to have different needs and they all function kind of differently. So, certainly on the compliance team, it's much less likely that we would be texting externally or receiving, texts from, business related texts from external people. But it's much more common on the desk for them to communicate that way. It's much more natural. It's just sort of ingrained in the culture of that world. So, talking to them and making sure you understand what they need, because, maybe you do want to consider getting, firm issued devices for some people, but not others.
Yeah, and it's something to that point. It's not necessarily a one size fits all. Sometimes for a particular person, very senior at the firm or particular team, you're going to be willing to do more because it's necessary for their business than you are with maybe a lower risk team where you can just simply say, look, that's just not okay. You need to keep it on email if it's back office or something else. And I think that, Kelly, to your point, talking to your people, understanding what they need, not being necessarily insistent that we can only do one thing that applies to the whole firm. I realize there are some big organizations where it's too hard to create exceptions, but we found in other places, because the SEC, especially in those early actions, was really focused on the fact that very senior people at the banks were doing this. And that's why they felt, I don't care what your policies say, you're obviously not following them, and that's coming from the top. That at some places we said, okay, we need to protect the top. And that might mean that we have a policy that applies to the CIO that says, she can text and we're imaging her phone every month, but we're not going to take those efforts, and we can't take those efforts for everyone at the firm. We just made sure for exceptions that we were really good about advertising them. Because if I create an exception for Kelly and she's allowed to text, but I don't tell the people on her team that I'm collecting them, then they might get the wrong message and say, well, if Kelly texts, then I'm going to text. So we've been very clear so that so they really understand the tone from the top. And frankly, where firms have invested a lot of time in these trainings, you have the PMs, principals saying, this is what I do. I'm complying with this. Everybody needs to comply. We spent a lot of time. We spent a lot of money. We don't want to pay a fine for this. So we really need everybody to fall in line. When that's coming from the top, when it's not just the compliance department kind of wagging their finger saying, no, no, it makes a dramatic difference at firms.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of my rules here when it comes to drafting policies is, don't make it too hard to comply, right? And it's sometimes it's just that simple. So, Kelly R., as you've gone through your policies and put them together, what do you think about when you're drafting these E-Comm procedures in particular?
Well, like I said, first, you've got to understand, how people are operating. And then from there, you can really figure out what the procedure should be so that people can comply really easily. So one of the things that we've considered is, having sort of a separate email address where people can send messages. You just screenshot the messages and then send them into a dedicated email address. Another option that we've given people is to send the messages to themselves, because really the main thing is to get it back onto the system. So any way that they can do that is great. I like the dedicated email address better because they're all sort of housed in one place. I can review them easily. When you get screenshots, you don't get the benefit of, the lexicon that you might have in your email retention system. So I do review everything that comes in there. So another reason why it benefits you to have them all in one place. The other thing is, if you do have an SEC exam, you want to be able to sort of categorize the messages, review them easily. And so if they just kind of go into your email retention system, you may not be able to retrieve them as easily as you would if you've got them stored all in one place. And I think the other kind of point is training on making sure that people understand that it is and should be messages sent or received. I think people are really focused on their own behavior in this situation, and it's important, to draw their attention to what are they receiving on their phone. And I think, that should be a training point, because as Kelly said before, a lot of the earlier enforcement actions were not from exams, not from enforcement. It was, they were doing an investigation on another firm and they see, there's text messages between these two firms. And then they go to the next firm and say, well, we know you have text messages because we did this investigation with a totally different firm. So just making sure people understand that. Because I think they think, generally that it's all about them, but it isn't necessarily.
And I guess it goes back to your point, Kelly Kay, about, a lot of these came from enforcement, which means in a lot of cases, they were snooping around somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And to Kelly's point, we found that also. I agree that the most important thing is that you're getting them onto archiving systems. But initially, we used to say send it to yourself. And there's issues with the screenshots are not word searchable in the system. So to Kelly's point, you're not picking them up in your search, and it's harder to run a search of every message I sent to myself that had an attachment. When we did the dedicated email box, it both put them all in one place, but it also became some place where we could audit. So it really was something else that we could point to, that in addition to all the other things we were doing, as these messages trickle in, we're keeping an eye on them. You sometimes, again, you're not usually worried about the people who are sending in the messages, but sometimes you'll see Kelly just sent in her messages, but she was messaging with someone else at the firm. Why didn't that person send them in? Let's go follow up on that. Or we're starting to see more and more messages coming from this certain app. Maybe it's getting more popular. That's consistent with what the 2018 risk said about kind of keeping up with the changes. So maybe it's getting more popular. Let's investigate why our people are using it. Either we might want to tell them don't use it, or we might want to find a way to capture it if it really is getting more popular and something that our people need to use for business.
Yeah, and just
that makes sense. So, I mean,
sorry, Matt, just one other sort of practical thing that you can do is when people are screenshotting and sending in text messages, they're coming from Gmail, Hotmail, those email extensions, and those we've had raised, to the top of our email searches. So sometimes we can capture them that way if somebody hasn't sent it to the dedicated email address and sent the screenshots to themselves. So one way you can kind of keep an eye out for them.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess, it's tough, right? Because if you have the screenshot, it's like you said, you can't search it or whatever. But then I'm just kind of fast forwarding to when the SEC's here and they're asking for all your messages on a topic, right? Mm-hmm. So you can then search your email archives supposedly for the topic. And then you kind of have to go back and look through this account as well, right? To see if there's messages that might be responsive. So, we may be adding some work on the back end, but I guess the true advantage of that dedicated location is, you're right, you can test it. And, Kelly's sending messages in, but Matt never sends any messages in. And what's that mean? Does Matt have none? Well, here's a message from Matt to Kelly, and we only have one side of it. So I can see where that is helpful. And I do like, Kelly Kay, I like your point too, as well, of seeing, looking at emerging technologies or new apps that come along. I think, if we've started out, and I think it was even in the objectives or the promo for this webinar, it's like, is no an answer, when it comes to approaching some of these things. And to me, it really comes back to, you got to meet your clients where they are. And if you're in the retail wealth manager space, clients probably have an expectation of text. They may have an expectation of DMs on social platforms, whatever it is, right? We've got to figure out how the business needs to get done, and then go figure out how we can capture it. If you have a global business and are operating in Asia or South America, WhatsApp is a requirement. So to pretend that, that doesn't happen is, we're selling ourselves short. So it really comes back to, okay, that's what's out there. How do we get it in? And again, it comes back to, don't make it hard to comply. Just, it really is, keep it simple for your folks, make them understand it, and have the channels in place. My corollary to that is, of course, don't make it too easy or too tempting for people to violate. Mm-hmm. So, what are some safeguards that we ought to think about from that standpoint?
Yeah, so people have been really creative in thinking about ways where there just might be some inconsistencies. So, for example, some managers pointed out that while they didn't want their people to text, their signature blocks included cell phone numbers that weren't captured. And so that kind of was leading to more text coming in. So either change that to numbers that could be captured, or remove that from the signature block, or in some cases even had a reminder of, our people communicate by email, or we ask that you not chat with them. You need to be a little careful that the reminder isn't an affirmative statement that's not accurate, like we never text here, which wouldn't be accurate from places. But firms have thought about, where are the breakdowns and how can we address them? And so that signature block's just one example, but where they did see that it was inadvertently kind of frustrating compliance with what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, it's out there, and I'm probably more for an Outlook client on the laptop or desktop that can be a signature agent that actually controls what's in that signature block. So I can't default to a signature block that has my personal cell phone number, and it has to use the company number. I'm not sure. I haven't seen comparable technology for the mobile device when I'm using the Outlook app or whatever. But, again, driving that signature block or maybe getting people to attest to the signature block that, you don't have that number in it. And again, just another tool to kind of take away some temptation. Believe it or not, I've still run across clients that still allow people to access personal email sites from their work computer. And, to me, it just feels like way too much temptation. Again, I live in the real world. I'm not going to stop somebody who's trying to do something. They have a phone on their desk with their personal account. But when it's that easy, it just seems to be a little bit too much temptation. Also kind of fits in, and Kelly R., I think you made the point earlier around, coordinating with your technology folks. And, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are data loss prevention kind of concepts that are really applicable here as well. So it's
it's one other thing. I was thinking about, obviously you don't want people to have access to, social media sites or personal email. But the other thing that is, good to think about is, are there any firm systems that would allow you to share documents or information externally? So, OneDrive is a good example. If you don't have the right settings on your OneDrive, you can share, a OneDrive folder from your work computer with your, Gmail account and share documents that way. So another good place to look to make sure that you've got all the holes sealed.
Yeah, and it really depends on the firm. Absolutely. For the most part, we've seen personal emails been shut down for a long time. More to your Matt, to your point, because of cyber and concerns with uploading information from the firm and it going outside of firm systems. In terms of what you can allow, not allow, at some firms, they need access to Twitter and X to do part of their research. So it's how do you remind people that any place where there's instant messaging, it either needs to be captured or it shouldn't be used for business purposes. So sometimes when you are granted an exception or looking over what you allow, for investment research, those can be good training points. To the earlier point on keeping the policy simple, you don't want to sit there and list out every single thing that might have an instant message. Again, I think that just clutters the policies, but these are things that come up in training. And we do find that employees are very engaged during the training. They understand that this is an important issue. They're seeing the dollar amounts associated with these enforcement actions. They are curious to understand what's going on. And I do think they want to comply. They don't want to be turning over their phones in enforcement actions and exposing all their personal messages. So that is a great place to reinforce some of these issues.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. So let's kind of jump to our next polling question and just to see what kind of communication channels you allow your staff to use for business. And I think, the points just made are good ones that, may be different for different people inside your organization as, as they think about it or as their business dictates it. I think, Kelly Kay, to your point as well, when you do make those carve outs for, these folks need to be, there are social media teams, so they need to be on Facebook or X, documenting those exceptions or documenting why you're doing certain things. You made the point earlier about, hey, if your CIO is allowed to text, but we image her phone, documenting, why that happens and why we and how we mitigate it is critical there.
And while we're waiting for the poll results, I see LinkedIn's on there. LinkedIn is a controversial one. LinkedIn can be captured. At some firms, employees feel really strongly they don't want their LinkedIn captured. That's how they're going to find their next job, and they don't want their current employers in their LinkedIn. At a place where you're reinforcing that it should only be used for making connections, non-firm, substantive firm business, that probably works fine. In other places where LinkedIn, maybe for certain people, is being used more substantively, like, for example, to self-source experts on a particular topic, then it's going to be harder to defend not capturing it unless you have unless you know it's really being limited to just some very logistical setting up the call. So it can really, that one just stands out because one can be polarizing, and it really can depend on how it's being used.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think we'll take a peek at the results here too. But it can very much be role based, and again, you have an analyst or a portfolio manager. You may treat them differently than you treat the ops team, where you don't have as much risk. Your real risk with them is the same reason LinkedIn's controversial, right? That they're going to find their next job through a LinkedIn Messenger. So I think you really do have to look at the roles. And then it's target how you're going to handle that. So again, maybe if you're in a retail environment, you have financial advisors, you are capturing their LinkedIn traffic, or the analyst, and you are capturing those messages. And then for everybody else, maybe it's adequate to have kind of a quote social media policy that says, hey, here's what you can and can't post. And I don't want you posting, things about financial topics or that are tangential to the business, but I will allow you to like or repost to use. There are tools, in the marketing space for that allow you to repost with a message, and and that way it's you're still basically making it the firm's marketing message without going down that rabbit hole, but and allowing people to engage and manage the things that they want to manage in their profile, while probably still helping the firm along the way. So yeah, I mean, I think text is pretty prevalent, obviously Teams and Zoom, and then everything else kind of trickles off. Telegram, again, if you're in the crypto or digital space, probably, very important that you're using those kinds of messages. All right, so interesting stuff.
Matt, do we want to take a few of the questions that have come in?
Yeah, I'm kind of working them in as we go.
So there's one on Zoom. If
do you want to go ahead
and start talking about different things? So
Absolutely.
Some firms have, for the Zooms they host, have disabled Zoom messaging, or have just, again, as a training point, have reinforced that would be off channel if they're not capturing it in certain ways. For the most part, and this would be dependent on the firm, we don't see pervasive use of Zoom for substantive messages. It's usually for something that's just happening in the moment. So that hasn't been a place where we've seen a lot of significant and concerning violations, but it is definitely something to think about. And if we have some firms that get really creative where they have a Zoom line open all day long for the remote trader. If you had something like that, where if Zoom was suddenly being used in lieu of Teams, where it could be substantive and could be about the trading, then you'd want to spend more time on it. But yes, you should be thinking expansively to all the different things that have messaging functionality. And actually, when we do diligence of research providers, one of the questions we ask is if their app or their website has any messaging functionality, just so that we're always thinking about where might messages come in. Because so many places now kind of want to make things more convenient that it can get very porous in terms of the places where you might have violations.
Yeah, and some of it does feel like a rabbit hole kind of problem, right? That you go to a conference and there's a conference app, and a lot of conferences use the Cvent platform, right? It has messaging function. I've seen it at compliance conferences, and I think maybe that's a test for the compliance folks if they actually use the messaging. But so I think you look at that and say, okay, I can vary. So it does get back to what's really important and what's really relevant, assessing the risk that's involved in some of those scenarios, and kind of driving from there. Hey, Kelly, I do want to pick up real quick on a point, because I think we touched on it about, and just kind of training and communicating, but the idea of setting the tone at the top. And I know you and I have talked about kind of how your CEO approaches this, and again, maybe you have different rules for him because of the way he does business and the way you capture that info. But talk about how that's helped you in putting this together.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I hope that everybody has the support of their senior managers, because it is really, really helpful. I mean, not to say that you as a CCO can't give a really strong message, but having them back you up is really, really meaningful. So one of the things that we do is make sure that they attend trainings in person and they stand up in front of everybody and say, hey, listen, you all need to comply. This is really, an important issue, and we're doing it ourselves. And so I just think having just that little bit of muscle behind the message that you're delivering is really helpful. I mean, listen, we're talking about changing people's behavior and influencing the firm culture, which is really hard to do alone. So when you have that support, it's really, really helpful. And it really, I just think it sends a much stronger message. But as far as, what you can actually do is, one of the other things that you can do too is have your senior management talk to people managers, right? Send that message to them. And, it's likely that, the managers report directly to senior management. And that message is going to trickle downhill from there too. Like, just make sure everybody knows how serious you are and how serious senior management is. In a larger firm, I think it's probably, maybe people look at it as you don't want to sort of make yourself known to the CEO in a negative light. And in smaller firms, maybe the CEO knows who you are, but you want to make sure they don't, think badly of you. So I think that can be really meaningful as far as how people think about it. And one thing I think you said this before, Matt, is making sure that if we're applying different standards to different people, is making sure that people know that the CEO is complying with the rules themselves. Yeah, so I think if you continually give that message, it will just eventually become ubiquitous.
Yeah, and training's critical here too, right? So, obviously, I think we all understand the idea of formal training sessions, and maybe it's moved from one slide in the annual training to 3 slides or whatever. But just in the interest of time, I want to kind of cut to one of the other things that I know you're doing that's a great practice of just the informal things, right? Periodic emails and other types of reminders. So kind of, talk about how often you do that, or, kind of what your approach is.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think training is so important, but it is a really tough thing to balance. I heard someone say, this was a couple of years ago, but she said, oh, I send out a daily email about, no texting. And I was like, well, that's just overkill. People are not going to pay attention to that if you see something like that every single day. So we do it periodically. I would say we do it, we do one, big annual training. And we've been doing that for several years now. And I think the message changes over time. So you want to make sure you're not just reiterating the same message, but make sure that, you're bringing up sort of current events. And as far as current events go, we also send, when we see these sort of big enforcement actions come through, we'll send firm-wide emails just saying, hey, listen, this is a serious issue. Wake up. Make sure that you are complying with the policy. We'll send links to the policy, and I also take the opportunity. I do sort of targeted trainings for people throughout the year. So even if it is on a totally different topic, I might just sort of end the training by saying, "Hey, by the way, don't forget about your electronic communications policy," and we'll just give some reminders there. So I never really let people forget. And I would say I'm seeing, some results of that. I think people are waking up, they're understanding a little bit more. Training generally takes time. And what I mean by that is the first time you train somebody on something like this, it's not going to resonate. It just takes time. The sort of regularity and seriousness at which you do these trainings will resonate with people eventually. So now I'm seeing more nuanced questions and more regular, screenshots of emails. So I can tell that people are understanding and they're complying.
Yeah, and on that point, all the things that Kelly was talking about, we're pointing to those in an exam if E-Comms are coming up or in an enforcement action, that even if it's not perfect, which it's not going to be, look at all the things that we've been doing to reinforce the message. We also often will do a training before we finalize a new policy, because sometimes in the training, as I mentioned, they can get really interactive. If we're hearing feedback, we're rolling out Teams and WhatsApp, and someone's like, I can't do this without iMessage, we want that feedback before the policy rolls out. We also want the training. We've updated certifications, because one of the things the SEC was doing in enforcement actions is it would see that you had a texting problem, and then it would say, and look at your certification. It's a check the box. You said you're in compliance. You're not. Now you not only have a texting problem, but you're also not being honest in your certifications. Mm-hmm. So we try to make it something that's more of a survey that forces people to stop and really think and look at the phones. And we reinforce that in training before we rolled out the new ones, because we didn't want people to fill them out incorrectly. And I know there was a question in the text about whether you can rely on certification sometimes for back office. I think it depends what the back office is doing and how meaningful those certifications are. But we have seen in those lower risk roles where people are less likely to be messaging because most of their stuff is internal. You can see that they do their work on Teams, that you can get comfortable with robust certifications where you're at least doing some kind of sanity check. And, like we said before, it's not going to be a one size fits all. What works for the back office might be different for the investment teams.
Yeah,
but I think it's,
that's a good point too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
No, I was going to say to the specific attestations or certifications in general too, it's, you want to make sure that you're not playing never have I ever, right? And you don't want to attest that I've never sent a text message or received a text message. And one of you hit on that earlier, but make the attestation say, yes, I've complied with the policy. I think the risk alert lays this out, right? That I've done the training, I've complied with the policy. So whatever the policy says I have to do, it doesn't mean, so it allows for that repatriation of the message. And then I'll commit to continue to comply in the future. So just trying to hit all of those types of issues. I do have a couple of other places to run before we run out of time. So, I think one of the things we got to think about is, what are the clues maybe real quick that we might have an off-channel problem? What do you think about? What do you look at?
You run an investment advisor and you don't have any text messages. You probably have a texting problem that you don't know about. Right. That's become a giveaway on exams. So on the standard exam request asks for exceptions to your policies. It's now become routine that managers are putting something in about texting. They're not necessarily sitting there saying, here's every single text I collected, but whatever action they took in the past year or two where they've tried to get their arms around or identified an issue, they're documenting that and explaining to exam staff exactly how they addressed it. It's a combination of self-reporting, attestations, doing some searching on channel, right? You're looking for indicia that people are having messages off channel. And I do think this is a place where AI, as we use AI in surveillance more, and it's been slow to roll out in some of the places where our RIAs archive their messages, but where it becomes not just lexicon based, but are we noticing patterns? Does Kelly stop messaging this person who she used to message all the time? What's going on there? I think it will be easier to detect things that are offline. In some places where they've had to be more aggressive, there are sometimes spot checks of the personal phones. That's a cultural decision, and sometimes it's in response to actions they've had or reasons that they feel that that's necessary. But I think a lot of the places we work with are trying to do kind of a trust but verify and not necessarily invade the truly personal apps and devices if they feel like they're otherwise getting compliance from their employees.
Yeah, one of the things I like to think about too is, are there clues in your business, right? Can you, if you're a retail-based shop, can you select transactions and go find the backup? And if the backup doesn't exist on your system, where'd the trade come from? So that may give you a clue that there could be some off-channel communication with the client or, those types of things to just kind of, really think about why things are happening or what clues exist in the business. So I went ahead and threw up the last question about the mobile device policy. And if you haven't voted yet, maybe you listen to what we say here in the next 30 seconds about, is there a right answer on BYOD or a company device or, or does it just simply come down to a matter of what's going to work in your organization?
Yeah, well, we're looking to see what people say. In general, we say, listen to your employees. Kelly, I think Kelly, you explicitly said that earlier on. We had some places where they said, we want to impose 2 devices on everyone, and got pushback from people who said, I'm not going to carry 2. So you're actually going to have a higher risk that I'm infecting the other phone. Again, that might not be realistic at all places, but you do want to try to do something that's responsive that people are going to use. Because if you make it hard to comply, you're just going to have a lot of violations, and you might invest a lot of time in a second device and actually make your problem worse.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it might depend, and it might depend on the role. That, if someone wants the separation, then, and they'll actively work that way, and that behavior, is better for them. Great. If folks would rather have one device and they're willing to be disciplined about using the right app for the right reason, and you have these other controls in place. I mean, again, I can take 2 phones and put a rubber band around them, and really accomplished anything with the second. There's a problem, or if somebody's trying to do something, they're going to do it. One of the other points that I think is worth making here too, when it comes to working with your technology or setting your policies, I mean, this just can't be a set it and forget it kind of approach, right? So I think this actually, we had a question, making sure that your data capture is working. So we've got a lot of moving parts in this ecosystem, right? We've got different kinds of devices. We've got all these apps. We've got an archiving platform. We've got all these communication links. And, everybody patches software every day, so data failures happen. So I think it's critical here for folks to make sure that you're testing your that your messages are actually making it to the archive, right? If you have a trading floor and you usually have Bloomberg messages, and all of a sudden there aren't any Bloomberg messages in your archive system, rest assured your traders didn't stop using Bloomberg. So it's there. It's indicative that it's a breakdown. Maybe there are things you can do with your technology folks to do some kind of monitoring, again, around feeds coming in, or, data populating, or if you can, apply some kind of testing or whatnot to the process. But, and if not, just old fashioned, log on to the archiving platform and see that you've got a variety of messages for, across time, and that you're seeing what you're expecting to see.
Yeah, and we are seeing that on exams. Now that managers are saying we collect all these messages and this is our new policy, we have seen exam staff, like they used to ask for emails saying, how can you confirm that the Bloombergs, the iMessages, the chats are all getting into your reviews, and just like the way you would have email. And so that will be, if your people are using the messages you've approved and you're not capturing them, that is going to be on the compliance department. So Matt, your point about making sure that you're monitoring for it and testing it really does make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're doing email review every single day. So if I log in and I don't see any Bloomberg messages, it will be immediately apparent to me.
Right. No, I think that makes sense. And I think, you're probably the exception than the rule on, how often you're looking at this stuff. But even if you're not doing the reviews, doing something to make sure that your data is coming in, because again, you don't want to go 6 weeks and find out you had a problem, because you're going to have a terrible time putting that all back together. Yeah. Well, we have reached the top of the hour, so that brings us to the end of our conversation. Kelly and Kelly, thanks so much for being here today. You guys were awesome and made for a great conversation. And thank you everyone for attending. So our next webinar is going to be on November 12th, and it's going to be at the top. It's going to be preparing for your firm's next SEC exam. So SEC trends and focus areas. It's going to be especially timely since yesterday the SEC Division of Exams released their 2025 exam priorities. So you can go to salisgrc.com/navigator to be notified about all of our upcoming webinars. So everyone, thank you for joining us today. Hope you got something out of the conversation, and have a great day.
Thank you.